All right, back at you. Had a little bit of something to eat. Hopefully, I'm less cranky. Gonna discuss the book now. I'll do one video on sort of the concept overall and the beginning of the book, and then I'll do another video about some passages near the midpoint of the book, and then next week we'll discuss the end of the book and overall. And I may try to organize a Blackboard collaborate for people who want to check in next Tuesday and say hello to one another before we sign off. But not, again, totally optional like your final. You know, I'm not here to police you and make sure you do all the requirements and meet the learning outcomes and all this bullshit that all these other professors are talking about in my ear at meetings that I couldn't care less. I want you to enjoy reading these books and continue reading books. Please, if it's ever crosses your mind to do so, I would love to hear from all of you after this class is over with an email that the question could be, do you have any recommendations? It's one of my favorite things is to know that my students are still curious about the world of the written word and these wonderful books that so many of us spend our lives writing and reading and appreciating and trying to conserve the values that come from the printed word. Okay, so this book's called The Impossible Profession, and she cleverly gets that quote or that name from a quote, a quote you would call, if you maybe remember the this epigraph. The word is an epigraph. A quote that before you start writing your book, you put a quote there. You know, if you're Hemingway writing For Whom the Bell Tolls, you pick a quote from John Donne, the great British poet. If you're Ta-Nehisi Coates writing Between the World and Me, you pick a quote from Richard Wright, the great black novelist. So it's a common practice. It's a good practice. Why waste your time trying to think up something clever and deep when you could just quote someone else, as you probably know. So if you look at the beginning of the book, of course it's in a very poignant way, and this was Malcolm's first book. The articles were originally appeared in the New Yorker magazine, where she has been a staff writer since long before I was born, 1965. Okay, she's been there. God, what is that? 60 years, something like that. Crazy. She was married to an editor. Her first marriage was to another person there, so she's a real lifer at this wonderful magazine, The New Yorker, which maybe you know, maybe you didn't, maybe you've seen the tote bags, if nothing else, around town. If you're in the wrong part of town, by which I mean the gentrifying parts of town where all the insufferable liberals live. But anyway, she dedicated the book to her father, who was a psychologist, and that's a touching and a very poignant thing because of, the one of the fundamental concepts for Freud, besides the unconscious, is the prevalence of our parents throughout our lives, from early childhood throughout, and especially that's captured by Freud's notion of the Oedipus complex, that you, as a young child, are, experiencing love for a parent and rivalry with another parent, or love and rivalry for both of them, or love for them and rivalry with your siblings. So this fundamental idea of the Oedipus complex, and how we have to, according to Freud, learn to abstain from that to give up that wish, to move on into maturity, and to not replay and repeat that wish later in life, as you saw with Dora, the danger she had of, um, falling back into this sort of obsession, bordering on uh, deep depression and melancholy with her dad and his mistress and so on. So, anyways, why is psychoanalysis an impossible profession, and what are these other ones? Government, teaching, and psychoanalysis, the impossible professions. Just look at the epigraphs here at the beginning of the book. Right after the title page, and then it says "To my father," and it has the information about 81. Again, the articles originally appeared in the New Yorker, in the magazine, and most of her books are like that. They were first articles, and then they become books. And then the very first epigraph, there's a series of them here, some nice ones. It almost looks as if analysis, that is therapy, where the third of those quote, and Freud puts it in quotes, like sarcastically almost, doesn't mean it really, so we should do it that way too, I guess. Impossible professions, in which one can be sure beforehand of achieving unsatisfying results. The other two, which have been known much longer, are education and government. So how are these things impossible? Well, if you take, I'm sorry, I put teaching here, maybe it's a Freudian slip in that. How is it impossible to govern? Well, I don't know, I've never been in governance, but I've read about it, and I've learned how difficult it is to enact a better society in all kinds of small ways in my life, professionally, and in my, politicians I've admired and movements I've tried to belong to. And but there's a great quote from the German statesman and scientist and novelist and poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe said something very funny. He said, when you're young and you're entering into statecraft, into governance, you think you can change the world. You're going to, of course you are. You're going to make things better. You're going to become a great person because of that. He said, by the time you're actually in power, later in adulthood, all you're worried about is making sure the garbage is picked up. So it's like, which is not an insignificant thing. You understand, like, how close we're on the knife's edge right now of like moving from civilization into barbarism. And one of the things that's stopping it is not so much that we're responding to the crisis by curing people, but that things like garbage collection are still occurring. So unsatisfying in that sense. Like, is that satisfying as a political leader to know that you're still picking up the garbage every day and little else is being accomplished? No, not exactly, but all the same, same thing with education. I mean, think of your own education, you guys. Like, okay, finals are coming up. You have some other teachers who are, I don't know if they're more sincere or more sadistic or something, but they're somehow different from me. And they're going to make you take exams, and you're going to study, and you're going to hopefully pass. But imagine this mental experiment. No one's going to make you do this. What if you had to take that exam again in 3 months without being able to study? How would you do? I know personally I wouldn't do very well. Did you actually learn the material? Not in a intellectually permanent way that you can feel satisfied. You have to. I mean, that's really why I'm always stressing that you have to keep reading and writing and enjoy the stuff. Is that otherwise it'll just go away. Your brain will atrophy. You'll watch too much TV, play too many video games, whatever it is, and you won't end up, despite the fact that you have degrees and went to college and at one point felt educated. You won't have it anymore if you don't keep it up, practice and maintain the character habit of it. So really the fundamental thing and then really much more like paradoxically, or as I would have said when I was teaching you Marx, dialectically, the more you become educated, something strange happens. You don't just suddenly feel like you know everything. What you come to dawning apprehension of, but it's like looking at the sun. You don't want to look at it for too long. It's going to hurt, not your eyes, but it's going to hurt your sense of pride, which is you're gonna realize when you're truly educated just how ignorant you still are, and how little you actually know. And just being aware of that at all, okay, that's a really unsatisfying. And then, so government, it's hard just to like keep the lights on, keep the trains running, pick up the garbage, okay? These are not things that people entering politics early in life are going into politics thinking this is what they want to do, but that's what you end up doing. Education, you go into it thinking you're going to really understand and learn things, and by the end of it, you're like, and then forget it, educating students, are you kidding me? Like, it's fun, but do I want to really be quote unquote assessed like they do with K through 12 and have you guys take tests and then make my salary dependent on how you do? Of course I don't. That's insane. Okay? I'm just happy, sort of like the Goethe being happy, the trash is. I'm happy if students are showing up to class with their book. I don't quiz. And don't plagiarize. That's it. Is that satisfying? Is that what I idealistically wanted years ago? No. Is it making me cry and before I go to bed at night? Of course not. No. Life is a comedy. It's not a serious drama. Okay, and then finally, the last of these. Why is psychoanalysis impossible? Well, let me ask you a simple question. Do you think people can change? Like, think about your best friends or your closest family members. Do you think the things that are wrong with them, and I don't mean like that they're limping around because their foot's infected or whatever, they have COVID. I mean, hopefully those things can be healed. But I'm talking about the little tics, the neuroses, as Freud calls them, the quirks, the oddities, the strange things about people that annoy us but also make them unique and hilarious, but that can make you very ill and debilitated and miserable. And can those things be changed? And the answer Freud is suggesting here is that no, probably not. And the name of the essay that he wrote this in, it was very, very late in his life. And again, if you think about Dora, he saw Dora for about 3 months. And most of his early patients he didn't see for very long, a couple years at most. By the end of his life, when he's writing this, he's asking the question, analysis terminable or interminable? That is, should you stop going to therapy, or should you continue going your whole life interminably without termination? And he basically sides with the latter, or you should periodically stop, but even suggests for psychoanalysts. And the guy who's interviewed in the book, Aaron Green, and then several other people in the book, all have gone, they're analysts, and they've gone back into analysis multiple times in their lives. So in that way, are the results of this ever satisfying or final when you go into therapy? No, they're not. People can fall back into old patterns, old habits that they were trying to correct and get away from, habits of mind as much as habits of action, forms of anxiety, feelings that you don't want, whatever, the neuroses, okay? And who is a neurotic? What does it mean to be neurotic? Freud says very nicely in one of his essays, a neurotic is someone who's a prisoner of their own thoughts. They don't control their thoughts control them. And we all have that problem to some extent. If you don't, fucking lucky you. So let's look, and then again, just going back and reviewing, Malcolm, and what's the connection between journalism? So the therapist, my pen died. That's very psychoanalytic. Why? The therapist, the analyst, as they call them, and then the journalist, how are they similar? The journalist critic, in our case, Malcolm, what does she have in common with the therapist, the analyst? Well, very simply, she is aiming for, and you hear this a lot from mainstream journalists and people like our president, our beloved leader, will tell you otherwise, but that's, and I don't even disagree most of the time. Neutrality, which can feel wrong. It can feel bad. Okay? Why? Because as a normal human being, when someone's expressing their problems and concerns to you, your initial gut reaction is supposed to be, I'm so sorry. How can I help? Empathy. The analyst is supposed to remain cold, and empathetic. Okay, not feeling for you, but as the analyst Lacan, the Freudian analyst, post-Freudian analyst Jacques Lacan, he said, and empathetic. Don't be empathetic. Okay. Why? Well, we'll get to that in a second, but in a classic example in the book, and this is a kind of classical work now of like introductions to psychoanalysis, patient comes in the office and says, my dad died. Normal person, I'm so sorry. Why is that wrong from the analyst? Well, very simply, the guy argues that if you react in that empathetic way with sympathy for the person, as an analyst, you're prohibiting them from then maybe expressing feelings other than quote-unquote normal grief feelings about the death of this loved one. Maybe the person is happy, see deep down, that person's dead. Maybe they never got along with them well. You don't choose your family. It's fate. It's good or bad luck. And if you express sympathy too quickly, you're prohibiting in a sort of subtle but nevertheless significant way. You may be saying to the patient without telling them directly, hey, this is not, it's not okay to have that feeling, to have an ugly feeling about a person you loved. Okay, so that's one example of where this neutrality that can feel wrong, that can feel, as Malcolm says, of journalism morally indefensible, is actually beneficial, not to you as an analyst, but to your patient and their ability to freely express themselves without feeling judged, which in life, there are very few places where you can feel that way, and really psychoanalysis, therapy, the therapeutic setting is supposed to be one of them. Okay, so let's look at just the beginning and just see the art of Malcolm introducing her this is, we would call this like you could call the book and her books in general, you call them it sort of blends genres, non-fiction novels. Okay, it's journalism, it's not fiction, but it has many of the attributes of fiction. So there's it's true, but then it's partly literary invention, meaning in the imagery, the setting, and especially the characters and the dialogue of the book. It has these attributes of a novel, of a story, and it's what makes it great to read, and it makes her a famous and successful author in the journalistic medium. So let's look at the very beginning, page 3, where she introduces this guy under the pseudonym she's given him, the false name. Aaron Green, as I should call him, is a 46-year-old psychoanalyst who practices in Manhattan. Manhattan is, of all the places in the world, probably has the highest concentration of psychoanalysts, multiple institutes. It's hard living in this city, whether you're rich or poor. We could all use someone to tell our problems to. Me, I prefer the bartender, but we can't go to them these days, so what the hell? All right, he has 4 patients in analysis who come 4 or 5 times a week and lie on a couch, and that's old school Freudian style, not once a week, but intensive, day after day after day. 4 or 5 times a week and lie on a couch, and 6 patients who come for psychotherapy once or twice a week and sit in a chair. Okay, which is worse? Which is more intense? Well, not only because of the frequency being more, but also because you're lying down, that form of analysis. Not therapy, but analysis. The lying down is crucial. It's supposed to resemble sleep. You're supposed to look away from the analyst so you can't worry about whether they're judging you. You know, the normal empathy you would feel if you're saying something uncomfortable and someone is like, what, you want to sleep with your mother? That's disgusting. Like that kind of thing. You don't. You're less likely to say that if you can look in the person in the face if you have to look in the person in the face when you say it. Okay. He is a graduate. So, anyways, he is on the faculty of a local medical school. The guy's a doctor. In as this is discussed in the book, in America, to be admitted and trained as a real psychoanalyst in the Freudian mold, you have to be a medical doctor as well. Okay, where he teaches and supervises medical students and psychiatric residents. He's a graduate of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. Those are like postgraduate degrees after his medical degree. And a member of the New York Psychoanalytic Society. He came to New York to study at the Institute after getting his medical degree and serving his internship and residency in a New England city. Okay. This guy is like, he's a successful adult on paper. From what we see here, he's got a career. He's charging nice fees for these patients. He has bona fide credentials from elite, schools in his profession, and he's on his way. Now the art of Malcolm, the physical description of the character. He is a slight man with a vivid, impatient, unsmiling face. So he's not a big guy, but in his face you see so much more than you would in your average face. She seems to suggest vivid, impatient, and unsmiling, almost contradictory states kept in the one in his expression, in his countenance. Okay, vivid, life, impatient, frustrated, but also unsmiling. So seemingly alive and lacking life at the same time. Maybe the kind of person you would want as a psychoanalyst, someone who needs to listen and be neutral, right? Unsmiling, but also someone who can't seem bored and disinterested and unalive. Okay. He has thin dark hair and wears professorial clothes. What are those? I don't do a good job of this, but the tweed jacket, the little elbow patches. I don't know, maybe when I get older and fatter, I'll dress like that. Or I have some of that stuff, but I've taken it not wearing it because no one else seems to care at the office these days. A herringbone jacket, as we were saying, a light blue Oxford shirt, subdued tie and gray flannel trousers are his customary apparel. He looks Jewish, like Freud himself, and And psychoanalysis was often by anti-Semites called the Jewish science. Now, as she describes in the book, this is embraced, especially the hardcore, the old school people keeping the flame of Freud going. He lives with his block and he lives with his son and his wife. He lives with his wife and his son in a brownstone apartment off Madison, 4 blocks from his office. The living room of his apartment is furnished with black modern sofas and armchairs, beige carpets, reproductions of modern art, photographs, folk art, archaeological objects, and books. He's a learned man. This is Freud's office. You should look it up. Look up Freud's couch. It's still there. Basically, everything was taken from Vienna when Hitler invaded, and Freud had the connections to leave. And all of Freud's personal effects, including the couch where he saw patients, everything, it's all at the Freud Museum in London. Very cool to see. He had this crazy red rug blanket that was on the couch. It had sort of a 4 posts and a roof over the bed. What do you call that? A canopy. And Freud was a huge collector of ancient artifacts, and they just were strewn about his office where he saw patients and where he worked, and they were kind of a fitting symbol for his thinking about the human mind, that there's, like those artifacts, there's the unconscious is full of these artifacts, these ancient wishes we have from childhood and everything. Okay, so similar to Freud in this way, it is spare. The guy's room, again, his office is spare, neat, pleasant, perhaps a hair study. That is, he's trying. He's young, but not young in your guys' terms, but for a psychoanalyst, he's not he's on his way up still. Okay. His consultation room is the kind of poor relation of his living room. The couch is 50s Scandinavian. Love that comparison, right? The house is like the rich relative, and the room where he sees his patients, where he does his business, like the poor relative. The couch is 50s Scandinavian modern rather than 70s high-tech Italian. The pictures are old MoMA reproductions rather than foundation-made exhibition posters. There are floor lamps instead of track lighting. The lights in the consultation room are kept dim purposely. That is, they want, when you lie down there, to feel like you're, in order to free associate and speak freely and get into the unconscious, they want you in a state, literally lying down and the lights off, a state not totally there, but sort of almost approaching sleep. Okay? The psychoanalysis that Green practices is of a most unswervingly classical Freudian sort. His thinking about theory and technique has been shaped by Charles Brenner, and we'll talk about this in the next video, the difference between Stone and Brenner and that kind of fundamental dichotomy in the modern technique of American psychoanalysis. The intransigent purist of American psychoanalysis, author of the forbidding elementary textbook of psychoanalysis, and with Jacob Arlo, of psychoanalytic concepts and structural theory, a once controversial, now standard advanced text. Brenner is known for his advocacy of a fanatically meticulous aseptic, that is, removing all traces of pathogen, of feeling. Technique, feeling from the analyst. Just sit there, neutral. And for his hardline theoretical position, which goes from Freud through the ego psychology triumvirate of Heinz Hartmann, Ernst Kreis, and Rudolf Lowenstein, to the quartet of himself, Arlo, Wan, and Bears. Green is contemptuous of most recent developments in psychoanalysis, dismissing them as fads. He is unimpressed by the French structuralist psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, whose impenetrably obscure writings have been gaining increasingly earnest attention here, that is in New York and America more broadly, but whose innovation of reducing the 50-minute analytic hour to a Delphic 7 or 8, or sometimes a single oracular parole or word murmured in the waiting room, has yet to be adopted. He is similarly skeptical of new theories of Kohut and Kernberg, derived from the work of narcissistic and borderline personalities. The this stir that Kohut and Kernberg have been making within and outside the field fills him with disgust. The English objects relations people who predate and foreshadow the Kohut and Kernberg groups are equally wrong-minded, he feels. When the name Melanie Klein is uttered, he closes his eyes and groans softly. Great line. Just when like you reserve your most, your hardest criticisms are often expressed with the least effort, just like, like the, who is Melanie Klein? She's the post-Freudian theorist. I honestly don't know that much about her, but she's basically had her doubts about some of Freud's main ideas, not the unconscious, but the primacy of the Oedipus complex in childhood development. And that really goes for all these people that he's describing as object relations. Object relations are supposedly these key behaviors that occur prior to language, really, when the baby's first kind of disconnecting from the mom. And prior to the Oedipus complex, which is supposedly develops between, roughly like 2.5, 3, and 5 or 6 years old, that stage of life. Okay, so let's look at one other part, which is this beautiful, beautiful, although very dark moment where what's her name? Janet Malcolm, where Janet Malcolm summarizes the relationship between herself and Green, and then uses it to leap into her overall, what is really her focus in the book, which is, this is why I teach these two books together. There's also the breakthrough concept in the case study door, transference. The feelings that you're having about the analyst are really not feelings about them. They're feelings about someone in your past that have been transferred to the analyst. Typically, feelings you had about your parents as a child. So you're revisiting and really reliving childhood and renouncing it finally through the transference and through the realization that it is a transference. Okay, and getting a hold of those feelings now, getting them in the air, getting them conscious through talking them over. Okay, very long process, difficult process, impossible according to Freud. Look on page 6. She talks about how she tried to go and see. Bottom of 5 actually says, the analysts I had seen so far dealt with me like as they habitually deal with patients on first meeting, courteously, neutrally, concomitantly, reservedly, abstinently. That is, they're not engaging. They're polite, but they're distant. And also has shown a certain awareness of being in the presence of a journalist. Like, this woman's going to snitch us out, okay? Which is what journalists do for a living, so be careful about talking to them. With Aaron Green, however, things were different from the start. He subtly deferred to me. He tried to impress me. He was the patient and I was the doctor. And again, you see that this guy has transference, as she says here. He was the patient, I was the doctor. He was the student, I was the teacher. To put it in psychoanalytic language, the transference valence of the journalist was greater than that of the analyst. This guy wants to, in effect, she becomes like his analyst, and that's really the interesting kind of conceit of the book, is that often when she's interviewing him, she'll ask something, he'll say something, she'll shoot back kind of acquisitively, sort of maybe doubtfully, maybe skeptically, try to press him on something, and then it just provokes him more, and he just keeps talking, and then she shuts up. And her absence of a judgment on that is not supposed to be meant to say he's right, but it's supposed to say sort of like, let him hang himself with his own words or whatever. Like, I'm neutral. I'm like an analyst here. He's the one talking through me. Okay, and then look at this beautiful paragraph, and then we'll call it, and I'll do one other video. The phenomena of transference, How we all invent each other, according to early blueprints, was Freud's most, I'm on page 6 now, was Freud's most original and radical discovery. The idea of infant sexuality and of the Oedipus complex can be accepted with a good deal more equanimity than the idea that the most precious and inviolate of entities, personal relations, is actually a messy jangle of misapprehensions, at best an uneasy truce between powerful, solitary, fantasy systems. Even or especially romantic love is fundamentally solitary and has at its core a profound impersonality. Think about that. The most intimate, deepest connection, falling in love with someone. She's calling it solitary and impersonal. That person is just, in a way, a screen on which you project your transferences. The concept of transference at once destroys faith in personal relations and explains why they are tragic. We cannot know each other. We must grope around for each other through a dense thicket of absent others. We cannot see each other plain. A horrible kind of predestination hovers over each new attachment we form. Only connect, E.M. Forster, the British novelist, propose. Only we can't, the psychoanalyst knows. The impossibility of that as well. Okay, so, and then she goes into the early cases of this. One of the classical patients, Anna O, who wasn't Freud's patient, was Alfred Breuer, who was Freud's older colleague, they co-wrote this famous book, early book, Studies in Hysteria, that Anna O fell in love with Breuer. Breuer didn't really report this honestly. Came out later. And then, conversely, although he was unconscious of it, he was having all the symptoms of being in love with her. And again, transference occurs in other areas of life as well, in relationships, between friends, between lovers, between students and teachers. It's everywhere, okay? It's everywhere. So I'll be back at you with another video, and apologize this one went so long.